If you have your Bibles, please turn with me to the book of James. Towards the end of the New Testament, comes after Hebrews and then James. And for the last several weeks, we've been taking our time, but we've been going through the book of James. And we started this series with a little bit of background about James. Right? He's the half-brother of Jesus. He was the leader of the church in Jerusalem where he was martyred for his faith. But he's writing to a Jewish audience of believers who are scattered abroad, and they're suffering. They're suffering poverty. They're suffering injustices. They are suffering, but they're also still trying to serve Jesus. And so the theme of James's book is all about living out your faith. Right? And so we talk about faith works, and faith doesn't just work in that it's effective, right? Faith works, but faith also has to be lived out. Faith comes out in our actions, and so in that regard, faith works. And so we've been talking about that, and some of his major book themes, subject themes. He talks about trials, he talks about wisdom, and he talks about wealth. Well, in the first section of his book, James presents three stabilizing truths for believers who are suffering but still trying to serve Jesus, still trying to live out their faith. And so we already looked at those three stabilizing truths. The first one deals with the theme of trials, and that was, I can rejoice and triumph in the trials of my life because I know that God is good, I know that God is on my side, and I know that God is using this trial to impart me with a measure of His strength. Stabilizing truth number two, which dealt with the theme of wisdom, was that God offers me the wisdom to put the truth to work in my life. Right? He says, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, right, freely, sincerely, and without holding back, and it shall be given him, but let him ask in faith. Right? We have to ask for wisdom with that hope and that assurance, right? With that settledness as to who God is, and he gave some reasons for that. And then stabilizing truth number three, which we looked at last week, dealing with the subject of wealth, is that God is using my trials to make me spiritually wealthy, right? And so he says, let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but the rich in that he's made low, right? The circumstances and the material possessions of this life, whether they be good or whether they be bad, they are temporary. But the things of God are eternal. And so what God is doing in us far outweighs what's going on in our lives around us. And we looked at that passage in Corinthians 4, I think it was 1 Corinthians 4, where he says, this light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. Right? He says the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And so that's kind of where we've been so far. In our message today, James is going to go back to the idea of trials, which is the first subject theme that he dealt with. And he's going to flesh out those ideas a little bit more. And he's going to address how to have a right theology of trials. Now, that word theology is a word that maybe we hear within the church from time to time. We rarely hear it outside of the church. But what does that word theology mean? Well, theos is God, right? And logos has to do with words. And in this context, it refers to the study of, right? And so a theology is simply a study of God, right? And so a systematic theology is a systematic study of God, right? And so a theology or a right theology of trials is one that gives us an accurate view of God in the midst of our trials. And so what James is addressing here is he wants to make sure that these scattered and suffering believers have the right picture of God while they're going through their trials. And so James is going to address this idea of trials again, and he's going to flesh out the idea a little bit more. And this kind of message from James is necessary because how often when we find ourselves in trials, regardless of what they are, regardless of how long we endure them, how often do we, in the midst of our trials, find ourselves asking the question, why is this happening to me? How many of us have ever asked that question in the middle of a trial? God, why is this happening to me? Why am I here? Why is this going on? Well, James recognizes this. He recognizes the potential for people in hardship to arrive at a false conclusion about why they're suffering, and he recognizes the potential for people in hardship to arrive at a false conclusion that God is the author of temptation and that God is somehow enticing us to sin against him, or at least offering sin to us as a test of our allegiance to him. And so often we come to this wrong conclusion about God. Oh, God is doing this to me. This is God's fault. And we take that and we use that as a way to excuse our failures. We use that to blame our problems on other people. And this is something that we see patterned for us in Scripture. We see this for the very first time in Genesis 3, when God comes to Adam and says, did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat? And look what Adam says. And the man said, the woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I did eat. See, what does Adam do? He finds himself in the midst of a hard situation, right? God is confronting him over a sin that has taken place in his life. And what does Adam do? He shifts blame. And in so doing, he points his finger at God. God, this is your fault. You sent me this woman. This woman made me eat, but you sent her to me. So really, this is your fault. If you hadn't sent this woman to be with me, I wouldn't have sinned. And so he's blaming God. We also see this idea addressed in Proverbs 19, where the author says, the foolishness of man perverteth his way, and his heart burns against the Lord. You know, we so often, and this is going to be the point of the message, we so often find ourselves in hard times as a result of our own fallen nature. Yet so often, we try to point the finger at God. You know, I'm suffering here, Jesus, and I'm trying to live for you, and I'm suffering here. What are you doing to me? And so often, we have this string of poor decisions, and then we question God when we reap the consequences of those poor decisions. And I recognize that not every hardship is a specific result of one of my poor decisions. Sometimes the hardship that I face is a result of somebody else's poor decisions. But regardless, so often we try to blame God. And so James recognizes the potential for people in hardship to arrive at this false conclusion, this false theology that says God is the author of my trials, God is the author of my problems. And so James starts this next section in verse 13 with another imperative. And we talked about the fact that James has a lot of imperatives. It averages out to like 10 per chapter. And so James starts with another imperative. He says, let no man say when he is tempted. And so the command is, let no man say. All right, and so remember, he's talking to believers, right? And so he's exhorting believers when it comes to their interactions with one another. And he admonishes them not to let the people around them have a certain viewpoint. Let no man say. And the context of the let no man say is temptation, right? Let no man say when he is tempted. And that phrase is actually a present passive participle of the word that we see in verses 2 and 12. Verse 2 says, my brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Verse 12 said, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. And so it's the same word, and it refers to a testing. And so literally what he's saying here is no man being tempted should say. All right, no man being put to the test can have this certain viewpoint. Well, being put to the test has the idea of undergoing things that challenge my faith, things that challenge my commitment to God, things that expose within me certain flaws and weaknesses. And so what James is doing here is he's admonishing believers to hold each other accountable, to resist a certain viewpoint when their faith is being put to the test. Well, what is the viewpoint? What is the viewpoint that they are to avoid? He says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Literally, from God, I am being put to the test. And it's the same word here, the same word for temptation, but the application of it is this draw to sin, right? Challenging circumstances, they challenge my faith, and they draw me towards sin, and towards despair, and towards guilt, right? Towards wavering in my faith. And so when he says, I am being tempted of God, or I'm being put to the test by God, literally what he's saying is God is provoking me to evil. God is provoking me to sin. And he says, don't let people have that viewpoint. Right? And what's interesting here, one commentator made a point here, what changes a trial into a temptation is the attitude with which I meet it. And so if I view my trials and my temptations as coming from God, then that shifts my attitude towards them. Ultimately, God becomes my scapegoat to be able to respond however I want and blame it on him. But when I meet my trials and when I meet my temptations with faith, then it becomes a growing opportunity, does it not? And so if I don't meet it with faith, then I have to find someone to blame. I have to find someone in order to excuse my failures, the failures that will inevitably result from my poor attitude. And so it's just this downward spiral, right? And so, we all have hard things that come into our lives, right? Most of us are either just coming out of one, in one, or getting ready to head into one. And so if you'd say, well, Pastor Benj, I'm not in a trial right now, and it's actually been a little while since I've gone through one, buckle up. It's coming. And it's probably coming quicker than you think. All right? And so we all have hard things that come into our lives, and James wants us to understand that God is using those things to grow us. He offers us wisdom. We've already talked about that. He offers us the wisdom to apply truth in our lives, even when it's hard. He uses the hardships of life to make us spiritually wealthy. So when we go through those hard circumstances, we need to be careful not to view those hard things as somehow being God's fault. Yes, he wants to use them, and yes, he wants to redeem them, but these trials and these temptations in my life, they're not God's fault. And so I should never say something to the effect of, God is just dangling sin and despair in front of me to see if I'm going to take the bait. God has done this to me to see how resolved I am, to see how committed I am. God has brought this trial into my life to see if I'm going to respond to it in sin. And it's the idea that God is provoking me. And James here is admonishing believers to hold each other accountable, not to view the trials of life as God provoking us to sin in order to ascertain just how committed we are to him. And so James says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Well, then we need to ask the logical question, why? Why the admonishment? Why do I need to avoid the viewpoint that says my trials and my temptations are God's fault, that God is provoking me? And the answer is simple, because that's not who God is. James has just spent 11 verses reminding these scattered, suffering believers of who God is. He's a good God who's on my side. He's using the trials of life to impart me with strength, hope, blessing, wealth, love. Therefore, it would reflect an improper theology of God, an improper view of God, to claim that God is the source of the draw to sin and despair in the circumstances of life that I undergo each day. And so simply put, that's not who God is. And he fleshes that out by giving two specific reasons why we must resist the urge to blame God for our trials and to blame God for our problems. He says, reason number one, for God cannot be tempted with evil. All right? And what we see there in the Greek is a linking verb and a predicate adjective followed by a genitive, which I believe is an objective genitive. And so literally, God cannot be tested by evil. Right? God cannot be provoked by evil. Right? And the linking verb there, it's the idea of is, right? So God is without the ability to be provoked by evil. Right? And so simply put, God is free of all of evil's influences. Evil cannot tempt and provoke and draw God to itself. God cannot be tempted by evil. God is without the temptation of evil. Therefore, because of that, reason number two, neither tempteth he any man. Because God is without temptation of evil, he cannot be a source of it. He is tempting no one. See, if God were the source of temptation, then he would be just as guilty as the devil was in Genesis 3. Remember when God looks, I think I said Jesus, but I meant God the Father. Remember when God the Father in Genesis 3 looked at Satan, and what did he say? Because you have done this, there are going to be serious consequences, right? You're going to go on your belly, you're going to eat dust, enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, bruise his heel, crush his head, right? There were serious consequences for the temptation that Satan brought into the lives of Adam and Eve. And God condemned it, right? God condemned Satan bringing temptation into their lives. And if God is so without temptation to evil, and if God so condemns the bringing of temptation into the lives of one of his image bearers, why should our theology of God allow us to think that he is a source of temptation? It's an improper viewpoint of God. It's a wrong theology. And so because God is without the temptation of evil, he cannot be a source of it. He is tempting no one. If he were the source of temptation, he would be just as guilty as the devil was. And so the conclusion then is that he is incapable of being drawn to sin. Therefore, he is incapable of drawing any to sin. It's not in his character, and it's not in his nature. We recognize that Christ died to rescue me from sin. And if Christ died to rescue me from sin, why would he or any other member of the Godhead then try to entice me with the very thing that he died to rescue me from? And so we must be careful to have a right theology of God in our trials, lest we somehow come to the false conclusion that God is provoking us to evil. And so you might say at this point, well, Pastor Benj, what about Job? I mean, what about Job? Well, let's talk about Job. Who put Job to the test? Satan. Okay. And did God allow it? Yes. But what else did God do? He put limitations on it. Hast thou considered my man Job? I'm going to say Joseph. Hast thou considered my man Job? There's none like him that loves God and eschews evil. And Satan goes, well, yeah, but Job doesn't love you for no reason. You've blessed him. You've given him all this stuff. If you take all that stuff away from him, he's going to curse you to your face. And God says, okay, Satan, I will allow you to take these things from Job, but you can't touch Job. All right, and so he goes and he takes his kids and he takes his possessions, right? And what does Job do? Does Job curse God? No. And so Satan comes back and God says, told you so. All right, Job didn't curse me. Well, yeah, but that's because it didn't touch him personally. See, if you touch Job personally, then he's going to curse you. Okay, all right. You can go touch his health, but you can't kill him. Right? And so who put Job to the test? Satan did. And did God allow it? Yes. But did God also put limitations on it? Yes. And did God stabilize Job while he went through that? And so does Job come out on the other side of his trial as a more mature, strengthened, wiser, and for that matter, wealthier person than he was on the front end? See, we've just looked at these stabilizing truths from the first 12 verses, and every single one of those stabilizing truths we see in the life of Job, right? Okay, so I can rejoice in my trials because I know that the trying of my faith produces endurance. Do we see that in Job? Do we see that Job rejoices to some degree in his trials because he knows that God has a plan? Yeah. Did Job maybe struggle a little bit with the wisdom to take the truth and put it into overalls? And did God help him with that? Right? Did Job ask God in faith for wisdom? And did God give it to him freely, sincerely, and without holding back? Okay. God is using the trials of my life to make me spiritually wealthy. Do we see that in the life of Job? So every single one of the stabilizing truths that James is presenting here, we see come to fruition in the life of Job. And Job successfully maintained a right theology of God where he says, God, I don't know what's going on here, but I know you're not provoking me to evil. I know you're good. Right? I have the right viewpoint of you. And so even though I don't understand why this is happening, I'm going to refrain, at least to some degree, from blaming all of this on you. All right? Now, he does say, I will plead my cause, and he does. But at the end of the day, Job does not blame God. And so these stabilizing truths are evident in the life of Job as well. And so James here, in these verses, James is not denying that God allows trials and temptations to come into our lives. Nor is James denying that God allows things that challenge our allegiance to him. Rather, James is reminding us that God cannot be seduced to act wickedly, and God will never seduce his people to act wickedly, but rather he offers his people in the face of that seduction, he offers his people a measure of his strength to endure those trials, to endure those temptations. He offers wisdom, he offers hope, he offers blessing, he offers love. He offers all of this to those who faithfully endure. And of course, all of this is a follow-up to the fact that he offers us his Son to free us from the penalty of sin, and he offers us his Spirit to free us from the power of sin in our lives every day. We call it progressive sanctification, right? And so sin and God are on two opposite sides of my trial. So here I am, I'm in the middle, right? I'm in the middle of a trial. All right, and God is on one hand, or on one side, and Satan is on the other side. Sin and temptation and wickedness, all of this is on the other side. And the question is, which direction am I going to turn when life gets hard? Am I going to blame God and go to sin? Or am I going to blame sin and go to God? God, this is your fault. Bam. Or do I say, hey, sin, this is your fault. I'm going to God. All right, and so this is the struggle. And while God is not the source of trials and temptations in our lives, the source of trials and temptations in our lives, it does have an identifiable source. And so James is going to continue, and he's going to say, hey, trials, temptation, the provocation to sin, that doesn't come from God. Let me tell you where it comes from. See, a right theology of God in trials has to include a recognition of where this provocation to sin and guilt and despair, where it comes from. And so he's going to address that. He says in verse 14, but every man is tempted. I don't know why it didn't slide. Well, regardless. There it is. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And so that phrase, every man is tempted, is literally each person is being put to the test. Right? Each person is being put to the test and consequently drawn to sin. How, when, why, where? It says when he is drawn away of his own lust. And so who's to blame for the provocation to sin in my life? My own lust. What does that word lust mean? What is lust? All right? We often think of lust as something that is sensual and erotic, but that word lust is simply a strong desire. A strong desire that exists outside of the will of God. All right? See, is it a problem for me to be attracted to my wife? No, of course not. Is it a problem for me to be attracted to someone who isn't my wife? Yes. And so lust is a strong desire that exists outside of the will of God. And he says he's drawn away of his own lust. The word is hideos. I don't know if that's where we get the word hideous. I don't know if that's where we get the word idiot. But the reality is that lust is both hideous and idiotic. So I don't know if that tracks or I don't know if that's there or not, but it tracks. And that word hideos means unique or specific. Right? This is where we get the idea of designer sins. Right? My flesh knows what I like. And my flesh knows what it takes for me to despair and for me to feel guilty and for me to be drawn to sin. And so when am I drawn to sin, or how am I drawn to sin? I'm drawn to sin by my own unique and specific set of desires. Right? And it says that my desires draw me away. This phrase literally means to be dragged, right? To like catch and drag you away. And so my own lustful desires drag me away and they entice me. That word enticed is deleadzo. That might be where we get the word delight. I don't know. But it just means to be lured, like bait. And so I'll give you an illustration. How many of us like to go fishing? All right? I like catching fish. I don't necessarily like sitting on a boat looking at water for hours on end. If I'm going to do that, I'll go sit in a tree stand because the trees and the squirrels are much more interesting than the water. And Pastor Jim's probably going to shoot me later. But anyways, that's where I'm at. But you think about fishing, right? And when you're fishing, what do you fish with? Bait, right? And the kind of bait that you use is going to depend on the kind of fish that you want to catch. And so we understand, at least on some level, that individual fish or individual species of fish have individual preferences for certain kinds of bait. So if I want to catch a bass or a trout or a shark, right, my bait is going to be a little bit different, right? And so I put some bait out there. But what do I put with my bait that really makes fishing effective? A hook. And what does that hook do? It grabs you. And once it grabs you, then what does it do? It starts dragging you away. And when you get dragged away, we're going to see this in a minute, when that fish gets dragged away and brought back up into the boat, unless it has a very benevolent fisherman, ultimately what's going to happen to that fish? It's going to die. And it's going to go in my belly, and it's going to be delicious. I grew up on an island. I love fish, right? And so the idea here is fishing, right? That my flesh takes something very very desirable, right? Because my flesh knows what I like. And what's it do? It puts a hook in it, all right? And so, you know, I get a little bit ahead of myself. So fishing. And I was preparing this message, and I thought about a clip from the Andy Griffith Show. And it's probably been over 10 years since I've seen this particular episode of the Andy Griffith Show. But in this particular episode, Buddy Epson, who plays Jed Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies, he's on the show, and he's a hobo, right? And he and Opie meets him, and I think maybe some of the other boys, and they start skipping school, and they start acting out, and eventually, Andy, as the sheriff, goes over to this hobo and says, "Hey, I'm sorry, you got to move along. Like it isn't good for my son. You need to move along." And the hobo says to Andy, he says, "Well, why don't you just let the boy choose what he wants to do? He's old enough; he can make his own decisions." And Andy goes, "I'm sorry, it don't work that way." He said, he's not old enough and wise enough and mature enough to make his own decisions. He says, plus, he goes, wrong ideas, and I think this might be a quote. He says, wrong ideas come packaged with so much glitter, by the time you realize there's a hook in it, it's too late. Right? And that's that same idea here, right? And for each of us, our lusts, our desires are unique, right? And I might not necessarily struggle with the same thing that another person does, but whenever that thing comes along, what happens? It grabs me, it drags me away, and it tries to entice me or provoke me to sin. And so I'll give you an example, right? Maybe your designer sin is anger, right? Maybe you're a hot-headed person, right? And something comes along and something doesn't go your way. And all of a sudden anger, hey, you should get angry about this. What's it do? It catches me, it drags me away, and it entices me to sin. Well, maybe my sin is, looking at garbage on the internet, and maybe I'm at the mall, and I discover that Victoria has a secret she wants to broadcast to the whole world, and what does it do? Hey, you should look at this. And what do I have to say? I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. This is Psalm 101:3. I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that go astray. Hey, isn't this floor tile really nice? Oh, and look, so's that one, right? See, what happens? Where does the provocation to sin come from? It comes from my own designer lust, that when an opportunity comes, it hooks me, it drags me off, and says, hey, you should do this. And that's a right theology of God in the midst of my trials. This isn't God's doing. This is my own flesh's doing. And so the answer to the question, where does the draw to sin come from? It comes from my own personal desires that take hold of me and try to lure me away from God, the same God who has died to rescue me from those. And I have a commentary here, and I think he says it really, really well. And so I just want to read this to you, and then we're going to keep going. He says, what one person finds as intense temptation, another person may never experience as even a faint enticement, and vice versa. Temptations are tailored to the individual, and so we as believers must never belittle a person for struggling with something we think of as an aim. Instead, we must realize that each of us has particular battles, nuanced specifically for us, and we need to give both grace and exhortation, that's where the right theology comes from, both grace and exhortation to one another to stand firm in times of testing. Conversely, we must also flee temptation regardless of how little it may seem to us. These inner longings, James says, busily work to pull us away from our Lord. He says, even if we do not actively court temptations, we are dragged away and enticed by them. They are most likely modal participles, describing the manner of the tempting. He says they also reflect well-known metaphors in the ancient world, the first from the occupation of fishing, the second from the practice of hunting. More on that in a minute. James forces us to take an honest look at the desires and thoughts that we foster and allow to grow within ourselves, tugging at us and alluring us. Many sinful actions begin as casual thoughts, but dwelling on them can turn minor temptations into major transgressions. And so it's important that we understand one, temptation doesn't come from God, and two, temptation comes from me allowing my own sin to take hold of me. And we need to understand this, because when I allow my sin to take hold of me, it leads to something, and it leads to something awful. And so we need to ask ourselves next, what is the end result of my designer sin? We see the answer in verse 15. He says, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. I don't know why this iPad isn't switching the slides. I may need you to switch them from now on, Kurt. I'm not sure. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. That word conceived is sun lambano. It means to carry with, and it is a word that can refer to a pregnancy, right? To undergo conception. We say, she is with child, right? But it also has the idea of being seized and apprehended, right? And so what happens is that lust takes hold of us, and when we give into it, it germinates inside of us. And he says, when lust has conceived, it brings forth, literally gives birth to sin. And this is something initiative, right? It refers to something that is initiated, right? Lust initiates sin. But it doesn't stop there. He says sin, when it is finished, right? This is the idea of completion, right? We've looked at this word a good bit. The word perfect in Scripture is often this word as well, and it refers to wholeness or completeness, right? When sin is finished, we could say when sin is all grown up, right? When sin is brought to maturity, when it reaches its full and final stage, it brings forth death. And the word is actually, the brings forth here is actually a different word. It's a combination of the word apo, which means from, and kuma, which means to wave or to billow over. And it brings a wave of death. And this one is a resultive, right? And so first you have an initiative where lust initiates sin, and then sin results in a wave or a billow of death, destruction, hurt, despair, guilt, all of the above. And so the conclusion then is that when my faith is being put to the test by a trial, and I'm struggling with doubt, despair, and guilt, I cannot allow myself to blame it on God and somehow claim that He is responsible for my circumstances. When I am put to the test, or rather, I am put to the test when I allow my unique desires to hook me and drag me away and entice me. So it is my own flesh that dangles the sin, guilt, and despair. Therefore, it is my own flesh that is the bad guy. And when I give in to temptation, I sin. And the result of sin is a wave of death, a wave of guilt, a wave of hurt, relational hurt, right? Spiritual hurt, right? And it's just this wave of death that sweeps away. And so James wants us to understand that. James wants us to have a right theology of God in the face of our trials. But James doesn't want to leave us on this somewhat depressing note that I am hopelessly trapped on this side of eternity in this perpetual battle against my own flesh, right? And so James does want to leave us with a positive thought on God, because he wants to draw our attention to faith in God, and what our faith in God does. And so he does want to give some encouragement. And so he continues on in verse 16. He says, "Do not err, my beloved brethren." Right? And to err means to be deceived, right? To be carried away. So he says, hey, here's where sin comes from. It doesn't come from God. Here's where the trials and the circumstances of life originate. They don't originate with God. They originate as products of the fall, of the sin nature that exists in all of us. But I don't want you to be deceived. And so I want to leave you with something good. That's why he says, do not err, my beloved brethren. And then he gives us a true ideology or a true theology of God to counteract this false, errant theology of God. Here's what he says. Every good and perfect gift, verse 17, is from above. And so whereas sin originates from human lust, good gifts originate from God. And so everything bad in the world comes from the sin nature and comes from the fall. Yet everything good in the world comes from God. He says every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. He says it comes down, literally descends from the Father of lights. Now that phrase, the Father of lights, refers to the creator of the sun, moon, and stars. And so every good gift and every perfect gift comes from the one who created the sun, moon, and stars. And of course, in this culture, the sun, moon, and stars were recognized as being very, very valuable, right? In a lot of cultures, they were worshipped. But what's interesting is that the sun, moon, and stars, they were also recognized as representing this ever-changing nature of existence, right? The moon waxes and wanes, right? And the sun, and summer and winter, and seasons, right? And the stars, and some days you can see them, and some days you can't, right? And so the sun, moon, and stars were classically the sun, moon, and stars classically represented the ever-changing nature of existence. But he draws that in contrast and says, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Hey, every good thing in this world and every perfect gift is from above. And it is coming to us from the God who created the sun, moon, and stars. But in contrast to the sun, moon, and stars, this God, he never wavers. He never changes. There is no shadow of turning with him. He is always good. He is always the same. His character never changes. His will never changes. His desires for us never change. He is a good God. And then he gives an example of that. He says in verse 18, of his own will. Right? Of his own will there. Reminds us that God does not act on any external force, but rather purely on the basis of his own desires, which in contrast to ours, his desires are good, where my desires are bad. So it says, of his own will, he begat us, right? And so this is in contrast to the analogy of birth in verse 15. Sin gives birth to death, but God of his own will, he begat us with the word of truth, right? And that word begat, the same word, but this word of truth here, it's a reference to redemption. It's a reference to the new birth, right? The word of truth is the gospel. And so every good thing comes from God, and of his own will, he paved the road for us to have the gospel, for us to have redemption. And so in the face of the lies and deceits of our flesh, God offers us redemption through truth. And so this is a right theology of God, and the end result of this is that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And that phrase, first fruits of his creatures, in this society and in Judaism as a whole, the first fruit was the most significant. Right? The firstborn son was the heir. Right? He was the one who was the heir of the family, and the firstborn son was consecrated to the Lord. That's why Hannah took Samuel. She wasn't a bad mom who didn't want to raise him. She consecrated him to the Lord, right? And you have the feast of the first fruits, right? So the first fruits, they were the most significant. And they were the ones that were consecrated to the Lord as an offering. And so when he says he begat us of his own will with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, God has given us the gospel so that we could be consecrated to him and not to our own flesh and our own sinful, lustful desires that give birth to sin and death. And so the application then of this passage is simply this. Don't blame God for your trials. Instead, thank Him for His gifts in your trials. Instead of saying, God, this is your fault, you're doing this to me, say, God, I recognize that you're good, you're on my side, I can rejoice in this trial because you're doing something. You're offering me the wisdom to apply your truth, which, by the way, this is applying truth right here. You offer me the wisdom to apply truth. You're using this trial to make me spiritually wealthy. You didn't create this. You're not provoking me to sin. It is my own flesh that is provoking me to sin. But in the face of my own flesh that is provoking me to sin, you offer me truth. You offer me the gospel. You offer me redemption. You offer me Christian liberty, which is the freedom to say no to my own flesh. And so this is the application. Don't blame God for your trials. Instead, thank Him for His gifts in your trials. Let's pray.